Melani Carter had barely stepped out of the executive boardroom when her phone vibrated. The screen flashed one name: Sandra. Her stepmother never called during work hours. Melani answered anyway. "Hello?" Sandra didn't bother with a greeting. Her voice carried the unmistakable satisfaction of someone who had been waiting to deliver a final blow. "I thought you should hear it from me," Sandra said. "I took the money from your trust fund and transferred it to Chloe." Melani stopped walking. The hallway outside the conference room suddenly felt very quiet. Sandra continued before she could respond. "She's the better daughter, Melani. She deserves that money more than you ever did. You've spent your whole life acting like you're special because your mother left you something. Well, not anymore." A long silence followed. Sandra laughed. "What? Nothing to say?" I expected screaming. Instead, Melani answered in the same calm tone she used during multi-million-dollar negotiations. "Thank you for telling me." The laughter stopped. "For telling you?" Sandra repeated. "Yes. That's all you're going to say?" "Yes," Sandra scoffed. "It doesn't matter anyway. The money's already gone. You lost." Melani glanced through the airport-sized windows overlooking the city hundreds of miles from home. "No," she said quietly. "I understand." Then she ended the call. Sandra believed she'd just won. She had no idea she had already lost. I had spent the previous 3 days leading a compliance review for one of our company's largest corporate acquisitions. Normally, nothing distracted me while I was working, but that phone call changed everything. Not because of the money, because of what Sandra had admitted. I stood perfectly still for several seconds before slipping my phone into my bag. One of my coworkers stepped out of the conference room. "Everything okay, Melani?" I smiled politely. "Family issue. You need to head home?" "Soon." He nodded and walked away without asking another question. Inside, my pulse was racing. The trust fund Sandra had just bragged about stealing wasn't simply an inheritance. It was the last gift my mother ever planned for me before cancer took her when I was 14. She had spent years building it. Every investment, every contribution, every instruction, everything had one purpose: to make sure I would never depend on someone else's kindness after she was gone. Sandra knew that, which was exactly why she chose it. She hadn't just taken money. She believed she had erased the last promise my mother ever made to me. I booked the earliest flight home. While waiting at the gate, I never called Sandra back. I didn't call my father. I didn't even call my attorney. Instead, I opened one secure contact already saved in my phone. There were only 2 words in my message. "It's happened." Less than 15 seconds later, my screen lit up. "We'll begin." Nothing more. No questions, no explanations. Just those 2 words. For the first time since Sandra's call, I allowed myself the smallest breath of relief. 800 miles away, Sandra was probably celebrating. She thought transferring the money meant the story was over. She didn't realize her own phone call had started something she couldn't stop. And before my plane had even begun boarding, Sandra's phone buzzed with an unexpected notification from her bank. The smile disappeared from her face. Something had just frozen. She had no idea why. By the time my flight landed the next morning, Sandra had already convinced herself the worst was over. She didn't know that I had no intention of confronting her the moment I walked through the front door. That was exactly what she expected. Instead, I drove straight from the airport to a quiet brick office downtown. The brass plaque beside the entrance read, "Harper, Sloan and Mercer, Estate and Trust Counsel." Mr. Daniel Harper had represented my mother's estate for nearly 20 years. When I entered his office, he stood immediately. "Welcome home, Melani. I wish it were under better circumstances." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "I've already been informed." I raised an eyebrow. "So it has started?" He nodded once. "It started the moment she made that transfer." "And the phone call?" The phone call made matters significantly easier. Neither of us smiled. This wasn't a victory. Not yet. It was simply the beginning of a process my mother had planned years before. Mr. Harper opened a thick leather folder. Inside were copies of documents I had memorized years earlier. When I turned 25, my mother had instructed the trustee to explain every protection she had built into the trust. Back then, I thought she had been overly cautious. Now I understood. My mother never trusted Sandra, I said quietly. No, Mr. Harper replied. She trusted the law. Those words stayed with me. After my father remarried 6 years after Mom passed away, Sandra slowly changed the atmosphere inside our home. Never dramatically, always one small comment at a time. Families should share everything. Keeping separate money is selfish. Chloe deserves the same opportunities. Whenever holidays came around, Sandra found new ways to compare us. Chloe has more compassion. Chloe appreciates family. You're too focused on your career. If I disagreed, my father always gave the same exhausted response. Melani, please don't argue. Just keep the peace. So I did. Year after year, I convinced myself that silence was maturity. Looking back, it only gave Sandra permission to become bolder. Mr. Harper slid another document toward me. I know you're wondering. I looked at him. The safeguards? He gave a slow nod. Every single one is functioning exactly as intended. I studied his face. So nothing has failed. No. And you're certain? I've never been more certain. For the first time since Sandra's phone call, I felt something close to confidence. Not because the money mattered more than my mother, because her final wishes were still protecting me exactly as she'd intended. Across town, Sandra was celebrating. According to relatives posting pictures online, she'd taken Chloe shopping before lunch. Designer handbags, jewelry, a luxury watch. By evening, Chloe uploaded a smiling photo standing beside stacks of shopping bags. The caption read, "Finally getting what I deserve." The comments poured in. Congratulations. So happy for you. Hard work pays off. I stared at the picture for only a few seconds before locking my phone. I refused to argue online. I refused to defend myself. Sandra wanted a public fight. She wasn't getting one. As I stood to leave Mr. Harper's office, his desk phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID. His expression immediately changed. He answered. Daniel Harper speaking. He listened without interrupting. After nearly a minute, he slowly hung up. Then he looked directly at me. They've already contacted us. I frowned. The investigators? He nodded. They've opened the review. Sandra's house had never looked more alive. Luxury shopping bags lined the foyer. Fresh flowers filled the dining room. Music drifted through the speakers, while catered food covered the kitchen island. To anyone walking in, it looked like a celebration. In Sandra's mind, it was. She had invited relatives, neighbors, and a few close family friends to celebrate what she called Chloe's exciting new beginning. Most of them believed she had simply helped her daughter financially. No one knew where the money had actually come from. I arrived quietly and stood near the back of the room. Several relatives noticed me. My Aunt Denise gave me an awkward smile. Melani, I wasn't expecting you. I just got back. She hesitated. I'm glad you came. Before she could say anything else, Sandra spotted me. Her smile widened. Well, look who finally decided to show up. The room became noticeably quieter. Sandra lifted her glass. Everyone, before we eat, I'd like to make a little announcement. She wrapped one arm around Chloe. My daughter finally has the future she deserves. Several guests applauded politely. Sandra wasn't finished. She looked directly at me, and sometimes, she paused dramatically, the better daughter deserves the better future. The words hung in the room. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. My father lowered his eyes. No one laughed. No one defended me either. Sandra mistook their silence for agreement. Chloe stepped forward wearing a brand new designer dress. "I've worked hard for this opportunity," she said proudly. Sandra nodded. "Exactly." Then she looked at me again. "You've always acted like that trust fund made you special." "It didn't," I answered calmly. Sandra smirked. "Really? Then you shouldn't mind that Chloe has it now." I met her eyes. "I mind that it wasn't yours to give." She laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Oh, please." "It's already transferred. You can't undo what's already happened." Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. My cousin Ethan quietly whispered to his wife, "This doesn't sound right." Sandra ignored him. She picked up her champagne glass again. Family should support the child who's actually worthy. The front doorbell rang. Sandra frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone else. One of the neighbors opened the door. Two professionally dressed individuals stepped inside. Behind them walked a woman carrying a leather briefcase. The room immediately fell silent. The older gentleman spoke first. "Good afternoon. My name is Michael Reeves." He displayed an identification badge. "I'm with the Trust Administration." The woman beside him introduced herself. "Laura Chen, Legal Compliance Counsel." Sandra blinked. "I think you've got the wrong address." Mr. Reeves calmly replied, "We're here regarding the Carter Family Trust." Sandra's smile faded. "What about it?" "We need to review several financial records immediately." Sandra folded her arms. "That's ridiculous. Everything was perfectly legal." Mr. Reeves didn't react. "Mrs. Whitmore, an automatic compliance review has already been initiated." Several relatives looked at one another. My uncle finally spoke. "Compliance review?" Sandra forced a laugh. "This is just Melani being dramatic. I'm sure she called somebody because she's jealous." I remained silent. Mr. Reeves turned toward the guests. "For everyone's clarity, this review was initiated automatically." He looked directly at Sandra. "It began before Miss Carter returned to the city." Sandra stared at him. "What? That's impossible. No one even knew." Mr. Reeves answered calmly. "The trust knew." The room fell completely silent. Chloe slowly lowered the shopping bag she had been showing everyone. "What does that mean, Mom?" Sandra swallowed. It doesn't mean anything." Laura Chen opened her briefcase. "We'll also need documentation supporting the transfer authorization." Sandra hesitated. I don't have it with me." "Then we'll obtain it through the trustee." Guests who had been laughing only minutes earlier now whispered among themselves. My aunt quietly stepped away from Sandra. My cousin stopped recording videos for social media. Even my father looked confused. Sandra suddenly realized the room was slipping away from her. She raised her voice. "This party is over. Everyone needs to leave." Before anyone moved, Mr. Reeves spoke again. "There is one additional matter." Sandra froze. He looked down at the file in his hands. "We're also reviewing previous transactions connected to this account." Every color drained from Sandra's face. Sandra stood perfectly still. The room, which had been filled with conversation only moments earlier, fell into an uneasy silence. "Previous transactions?" she asked, forcing a laugh. "That has to be some kind of mistake." Mr. Reeves closed the file in his hands. "We're simply following the compliance procedures required by the trust." Laura Chen added calmly, "Our responsibility is to review any activity that appears inconsistent with the trust agreement." Sandra looked around the room as if searching for someone to reassure her. No one spoke. One by one, guests quietly gathered their coats. The celebration had ended without anyone announcing it. The following morning, the formal review began. Sandra arrived at the trust administrator's office carrying folders filled with receipts and handwritten notes. She placed them confidently on the conference table. "These explain everything." Mr. Reeves opened the first folder. Laura Chen compared each document against the trust records. The room remained quiet, except for the sound of turning pages. Sandra finally broke the silence. "I used small amounts over the years. They were household expenses. I was taking care of the family. My father frowned. I thought those expenses came from our joint account. Sandra looked at him. Some did, some didn't. He stared at her. You never told me that. I didn't think I had to. The investigators continued reviewing records. Every few minutes, another transaction appeared. A transfer here, a withdrawal there. None of them were large enough to attract attention individually. Together, they painted an entirely different picture. Laura Chen highlighted several entries. These withdrawals occurred during periods identified as household emergencies. Sandra nodded quickly. Exactly. But the invoices don't match the amounts removed. Sandra's confidence weakened. There must be an accounting error. Mr. Reeves looked up. The accounting system has already been independently verified. Across the table, my father slowly leaned back in his chair. His expression changed from confusion to disbelief. Another folder was opened. This one contained documents requiring signatures. My father's signatures. He adjusted his glasses. I remember signing these. Laura slid another document beside it. The authorization you believed you were signing concerned home insurance. She placed another page next to it. This attachment authorized access requests to trust correspondence. My father's face turned pale. I never saw that page. Sandra immediately interrupted. You did? No, he answered quietly. I didn't. He turned toward her. You told me they were routine documents. Sandra looked away. For the first time since all of this had begun, she had no explanation. Outside the conference room, word spread quickly through the family. Relatives who had defended Sandra at the party stopped answering her messages. Several who had congratulated Chloe deleted their social media comments. Chloe herself sat alone in the waiting area. When I walked past, she stood. Melani. I stopped. She looked exhausted. My mom told me Dad changed the trust before your mother passed away. I shook my head gently. He never could. She swallowed. So, none of this was ever mine? I answered honestly. No. She lowered her eyes. I didn't know. For the first time, I believed her. Inside the conference room, Sandra became increasingly desperate. She called friends. No one answered. She called her sister. Straight to voicemail. She even attempted to contact the financial advisor she had blamed for the transfer. He refused to speak without counsel present. The confidence that had filled her voice during that phone call days earlier had completely disappeared. Late that afternoon, Mr. Reeves closed the final financial file. There is one remaining item. He looked toward me. Miss Carter? I reached into my handbag and removed my phone. I believe this is what you're waiting for. I connected it to the conference room speaker. Sandra's eyes widened. No. Mr. Reeves nodded. Please play it. I pressed one button. Sandra's own voice filled the room. I took the money from your trust fund and transferred it to Chloe. The room remained silent. She's the better daughter. She deserves it more than you. Sandra covered her mouth. The recording continued. The money's already gone. You can't do anything about it. Then my own voice answered calmly. Thank you for telling me. The recording ended. No one moved. No one spoke. Sandra slowly looked at me. For the first time, she understood why I had never argued, why I had never chased her, why I had never begged. My calm had never been surrender. It had been certainty. Mr. Reeves quietly closed the case file. He looked directly at Sandra. This changes everything. No one spoke for several long seconds after Mr. Reeves closed the file. The only sound in the conference room was the soft hum of the air conditioner. Sandra looked around the table as though someone would rescue her. Someone would explain that the recording had been misunderstood. No one did. Laura Chen folded her hands. Mrs. Whitmore, based on the documentation we've reviewed and your recorded statements, the transfer was not authorized under the terms of the Carter Family Trust. Sandra finally found her voice. I was family. Laura nodded politely. You were family by marriage. Sandra leaned forward. I helped raise Melani. That did not give you ownership of the trust. I had access. You had limited administrative access. I believed. Mr. Reeves interrupted gently. The trust agreement is very clear. He slid a bound copy across the table. The beneficiary has always been Melani Carter. Sandra stared at the cover without touching it. The funds were never yours to transfer. Laura opened another folder. The transfer has already been reversed. Sandra's head snapped up. What? The receiving account has been frozen. She looked at Chloe. No. Chloe reached for her phone with trembling hands. A notification had already arrived from her bank. Transaction reversed. The luxury purchases she had proudly displayed only days earlier were now under review. Several merchants had already canceled pending deliveries. One boutique had requested the immediate return of merchandise. Chloe looked at her mother. You told me everything was legal. Sandra couldn't answer. She simply stared at the table. My father slowly removed his wedding ring and rolled it between his fingers. For several minutes, he had said nothing. Finally, he looked at me. I failed you. I didn't interrupt him. When your mother died, I promised her I'd protect you. His voice cracked. And every time Sandra criticized you, I told you to keep the peace. He shook his head. I thought I was keeping the family together. I was asking the wrong person to sacrifice. Sandra finally looked at him. David. He didn't even turn toward her. You asked my daughter to give up the last gift her mother ever left her. I never agreed to that. Sandra's eyes filled with panic. You signed the paperwork. I signed what you told me was insurance paperwork. You trusted me. I did. He looked at her for the first time since entering the conference room. I won't make that mistake again. The investigation continued for several weeks. Because the trust had maintained permanent compliance records, every significant transaction Sandra had made was already documented. What investigators uncovered surprised even Mr. Reeves. The trust fund transfer hadn't been an isolated decision. Over several years, Sandra had quietly redirected smaller amounts whenever she believed no one would notice. Sometimes she labeled them as emergency home repairs, other times as temporary reimbursements. None had been authorized. Each one had been recorded automatically. The safeguards my mother insisted on years earlier had done exactly what she intended. They didn't prevent every dishonest action. They ensured every dishonest action left a permanent trail. Civil proceedings moved quickly. Sandra was ordered to repay every unauthorized withdrawal. The court also required reimbursement for investment growth the trust had lost because of the improper transfers. Criminal fraud charges followed based on the evidence gathered during the investigation, including her own recorded confession. She was removed from every financial role involving family assets. No institution connected to the trust would recognize her authority again. The woman who once believed she controlled everyone else's future could no longer control her own finances without oversight. The family changed just as dramatically. Relatives who had applauded Chloe's celebration quietly apologized. Some admitted they had always sensed Sandra treated me differently, but had never spoken up. My Aunt Denise visited me one afternoon. I should have said something years ago. I smiled sadly. You weren't the only one. She nodded. But I still should have. Those words meant more than she realized. Accountability wasn't only about courtrooms. Sometimes it began with honesty. Chloe called me several weeks later. We met at a small coffee shop halfway across town. She looked nothing like the woman who had celebrated at Sandra's party. No designer bags, no expensive jewelry, just quiet exhaustion. I owe you an apology. I stirred my coffee. You don't owe me one for accepting what you believed was true. She lowered her eyes. I should have asked where the money came from. You trusted your mother. So did you once. I couldn't argue with that. She took a slow breath. I'm finding a job. I smiled. That's a good place to start. We left that meeting without becoming close. But we also left without becoming enemies. Sometimes healing doesn't create friendship. Sometimes it simply ends the damage. A month later, I visited my mother's grave. The morning was cool. Fresh flowers rested against the headstone. I knelt beside them. "You planned for everything," I whispered. "When I was younger, I thought those protections meant you expected the worst from people." A breeze moved through the trees. "I understand now. You weren't teaching me to distrust people. You were teaching me not to surrender my future to them." I placed my hand gently against the stone. "Thank you." For the first time in years, I felt that chapter of my life close. The restored trust continued growing exactly as my mother intended. Instead of letting it become another source of family conflict, I used part of the recovered investment gains to establish the Evelyn Carter Independence Scholarship, named after the woman who had built the trust. Every year, it helps students whose education has been threatened by financial abuse, family manipulation, or broken promises. Watching those young people receive opportunities their own families couldn't take away became far more meaningful than any balance sitting quietly in an investment account. I also purchased the home I had postponed buying for years, not because I wanted to prove anything, because I finally knew I was building a future on a foundation no one else could steal. People occasionally ask me why I stayed so calm when Sandra called to tell me she had taken everything. The answer has never changed. Panic wouldn't have protected my mother's legacy. Preparation did. And the day my stepmother proudly told me she had stolen my future was the day she unknowingly handed mine back.